This is the tutorial for the 3D Depth Extrude and Swoosh kit, and right here I have the Swoosh-Medium Illustrator file open, and I'll go over that really quick. But first, a few things you want to do before you do anything else. Make sure you go to the font download links, HTML file, and download all the fonts listed there. They're all free and they're all on Font Squirrel, which is a really great website that's easy to download from. That way when you load up these files, all the fonts will be ready to go, live, and easy to edit. Of course, you don't have to use these fonts. You could switch these fonts out to be whatever you want. If you look at my layers palette right here, I have the swoosh and the type on different layers, so you can easily click the little lock icon to lock the type. That way you can just select a particular swoosh you want to use. You can even move these swooshes around and then recombine them to make new options for these swooshes. Many of them will work like that. Some of them might need a little bit of modification, but that's really up to you how you want to use those. And particularly when you're using the 3D Extrude options, I'd really recommend you go to Edit. And if you're on a Mac, this will be called Illustrator. Go down to Preferences, it should be near the bottom, and then go to General. Inside the General Preferences window, check out the box that says Scale, Strokes, and Effects. Just make sure the box is checked and then hit OK. Basically, the reason we're doing that is that way, if you apply an effect to an item and then resize that item, the effect will actually hopefully scale nicely with it instead of beginning to look really crazy. If, for example, if you make a really big item really small, the stroke will just overwrite almost everything else and not look good. So having that on kind of helps prevent that. So right here, we're in the Swoosh-Medium AI file. There's 3 different files included for these swooshes. There's a small, medium, and long. The medium's for words that's around 5 or 6 letters long. So when you have a certain word you want to apply a swoosh to, just check the 3 examples, figure out which one is probably the closest match for the length of your word, and start with that one. It'll save you a little bit of time when you're actually working with these. In a few windows you're going to want open. You're going to want your Pathfinder window open, which is under Window, and then Pathfinder. It's about 3/4 of the way down on the actual window screen. And you also want Window Graphic Styles open. It's right here on my screen is my Graphic Styles window, and that's a little bit closer to the middle of the actual window menu. Just make sure Graphic Styles is checked. The 3D Extrude options are Graphic Styles, so we want that window open so we can actually open those up. So I'll do that right now actually. So right here, I'll just drag it to my screen to make it a little bit easier to see. The Graphic Styles window, up at the top right-hand corner, there's a down arrow with 4 lines next to it. Check that, and then you're going to want to go near the bottom here to open Graphic Style Library. And then at the very bottom of this drop-down menu, it says Other Library. Click on that. Then you want to navigate to the folder that you downloaded with this pack. This might look a little bit different than yours since this is still my working file, but inside that folder there's a file called depth3dstyles.ai. You want to click on that and then hit Open. So I'm going to move this Graphic Styles window back over to the side here, and it should open up this new window of Depth 3D Styles, and each of these 34 different options right here are the Depth 3D Styles that I've included with this pack. And as I hover over these with my mouse, you can tell they're named like Depth 1, Depth 2, Depth 3. If I go all the way down to the bottom, it's called Depth 34. Those numbers are helpful if you go to the PDF instructions included in this set. There will be a page with a bunch of different numbers, all with a 3D effect applied. Those numbers correspond with the names of these different 3D styles as a quick reference guide. And there's also inside the actual download folder a PNG file of the same thing, so you can actually probably just open up that PNG, it'll be easier. But for instance, the number 20 will show you what depth 20 looks like. So when you hover over these, just look at the names and then you can correspond them with that guide to see what the actual effects will look like when they're applied. And also something to note when you use this, the size of your actual artwork is really important to the overall appearance of these effects. So I put an example page. On that example page, the examples don't look particularly fantastic. That's not the point. The important thing is that you want to size artwork roughly that big when you're starting out because it's an appropriate size for these effects. But I'm going to show you how to apply the effect to a swoosh and then do some more custom stuff after that. I'm just going to grab this swoosh and type combination right here. I'm going to move my window over. And then I'm going to hold down Alt or Option on a Mac and just drag and drop. That way it just automatically copies this. It's really easy. When you're applying these effects, you might want to duplicate whatever you're working on just so you don't accidentally overwrite anything while you're working. I'm going to go ahead and click on the type, then right click and hit Create Outlines. We want to do that because we want to make this all one object. Just as a quick example, if it's 2 separate objects and you apply a 3D style to it, the 3D style applies separately between these 2 objects, which if you're looking for that effect, that's great. But if you want the effect to look consistent throughout the entire word, you don't want this to happen. So I'm going to show you what to do to prevent that. Highlight over both the type as well as the swoosh using the selection tool. It's the black arrow, V as a keyboard shortcut by default. And then in the Pathfinder window that we opened earlier, Under shape modes on the far left, there's an option called Unite. Basically what Unite does is it combines all the objects that are touching together into one big object. So we're going to hit Unite. So as you can see, this swoosh is now one object. If I click and move it, it all moves at the same time. This is exactly what we want. As a quick little tip here, if you look at the way the swoosh combined with the type here, it looks okay, but it's not perfect. To make it better, once again highlight over it using the selection tool, and then hit B on your keyboard to select the brush here. And then hold down Alt or Option, and when you hold down Alt or Option with the brush tool selected, it turns the brush into a smooth tool. And I will link a smooth tool tutorial inside the font download links HTML file if you want a more in-depth version of this, but it's pretty simple. When you're working with the brush tool out, hold down Alt on a PC or Option on a Mac, and then in quick small bursts, kind of like this, just click, hold, drag, and then let go. You want to go over the lines you want to smooth. It very quickly smooths out these lines. I tend to make lots of really little, just drag and drop clicks to make these lines smooth out pretty nicely. You can spend as much or as little time doing this as you want, but the end result is that the transition between the swoosh and the type looks a whole lot better now. And of course, you can always go in with the direct selection tool, which is the white arrow. It's A on your keyboard as a shortcut by default, and manually tweak in some of these edges if you want to. But now that this is one object, if I go back in, highlight over this, and inside the depth 3D styles, I can just randomly pick an effect, and then all you have to do to apply the effect is just click it. It's really that easy. It'll very quickly apply the effect to whatever it is you're working on, and as you can tell, it looks really great. And if you want to try different effects, that's easy to do too. Just highlight over it, click a new effect, wait for it to apply, and you can go ahead and just keep on doing that until you find an effect that looks the way you really want it to look on your particular artwork or type. This really works great on stuff like typography, as shown here. Simple silhouettes and objects like that. Really complex objects, this effect might not work really great because it has too much to think about when it extrudes. But play around with different stuff and see what looks best to you. There's a lot of options to go through, so it's really up to you how you want to play around with it. And as something to note with this, sometimes due to the way Illustrator works with the 3D extrude options, sometimes the effect will look really crazy. Since upgrading to Adobe Creative Cloud, I haven't had this issue, but I had it in CS6 where it would look like there'd be big black streaks through the white of this type, for example. To fix that, all you have to do is use the selection tool and just move the object slightly. Usually that will cause it to re-render and then it will render properly. If it doesn't, just move it slightly again until it does look properly. And if you want to make sure that doesn't ever happen again, like let's say I'm totally satisfied with this, I don't want the effects to ever change again, you can go to Object, Expand Appearance, and then it expands all these different strokes and outlines, etc., and makes it into a permanent object. So if I were to scale it down, everything would look just the way you'd expect it to. It looks really nice. That's one way to prevent any unwanted changes, although do keep in mind when you do that, look how many points there are on this now. There's a whole lot of points. So that can really slow down your computer if you have a lot of these. So you want to keep the effect live when possible until you're really ready to be done and you want to just lock it in if that's something you want to do. If you haven't had any issues with rendering, don't even worry about doing that. It's not that important unless you really want to rescale this really huge or really small. You want to make sure all the effects look really good. And also as another quick demonstration, I'm just going to recombine this swoosh once more, just to give you something to think about when you're working with this particular set. I'm just going to quickly combine this. I'm going to drag it, duplicate it, and once again, remember, you can duplicate these by holding Alt or Option on a Mac, and then just clicking and dragging, letting go. It's a really fast way to copy it however you want. So as I said before, I made all of these sized appropriately for how the effects work so that they look really good when the effects are applied. You want to make objects roughly this size. If I make this swoosh type right here a whole lot smaller, really small, this is about a ½ inch long now. If I apply an effect, you can tell that it doesn't look too good. Like this is interesting to say the least, but that is not something you probably want to achieve when you're working with this. So you want to just make sure that when the objects are initially sized, that you make them big enough for the effect to look pretty decent. If I run that again with this, it has an effect that looks good and it looks like something that we actually want to achieve. And that way, if I were to now, with the scale, strokes, and effects checked like we did earlier, if I scroll this way back down again, it should look proper. And as you can see, it does. If you didn't have the scale, strokes, and effects checked, as we did in the first step through the preferences there, it would have looked kind of like the other one did with everything just blown out. The strokes would have been way too large for the object. So do keep that in mind. You definitely want scale, strokes, and effects checked. And that's either under Edit, Preferences on a PC, or Illustrator Preferences on a Mac, General, and then Scale, Strokes, and Effects. Just make sure this little checkbox is checked. It might save you some headaches in the future. But now I'm going to go back up to this one right here, and I'll go over a few more advanced techniques. If you really want to customize these, like let's say white and black really isn't your thing, you want to customize the color of the fill, stroke, 3D extrude, or even the drop shadow behind here. You can do all that if you want to and you feel comfortable doing it. To do it, you want to go to Window and then Appearance. Make sure you have your appearance window open. It's right here on my screen. I'm just going to drag and drop it over here to make it a little bit easier to see. And when you have the selection tool and you've highlighted over this object, you can see all the different effects that I've applied to it. There's a 20-point stroke. I really recommend you do not change the thickness of the stroke. It might really impact the way the 3D effects apply. You can certainly try, but I ran into some rendering issues when I tried making that stroke a whole lot smaller. 20 point seemed to be pretty much the sweet spot to make this thing look good, so do keep that in mind. But let's say we want to change the fill color. Just click on the white box next to fill, and then you can click on this down arrow and it'll go ahead and bring up the different color palettes. And these colors are all based on your swatches. If you want to use a different color, you can go ahead and add a new color to your overall swatch list, which is under window and then swatches near the bottom here. Or if you hold shift and then click on this fill, you can customize it using CMYK codes. If that's how you want to work, you can certainly go ahead and do that and just tweak it until it looks the way you want, or even enter in the percentages if you know what the percentages are. I'll just use the drop down menu here and make it a nice cyan blue. The same thing applies to the stroke. So here's a stroke box. I'm going to click the down arrow and let's make it a really dark blue to kind of play off this light blue we have right here. So now I've went ahead and changed the actual fill color as well as the stroke. To change this black 3D extrude, you're going to want to hit the 3D extrude and bevel button. It's just below stroke right here. Just click on it and then it will bring up this window. The first thing you're going to want to do is make sure preview is checked. That way you can see all your changes live, and then hit more options. It's right here near the bottom. Changing these different settings will really change the overall appearance of the effect. If you're a really advanced user and you want to customize the overall rotation and complete appearance of this effect, you can go ahead and play around with these settings if you want to, but for most users, I would recommend not doing that. The only thing you really have to worry about here is the shading color. Right now, it's set to black, so the box to the right of shading color is a black box. If I click on it, I can then go ahead and select a new color of my choice right here, and I actually want to match that purple, so I'm going to go back and see if I can't figure out what color this purple was. If I double click on it, it looks like the RGB is 46, 49, 145. So I'm going to write down those codes really quick, and then go back into the 3D Extrude and Bevel menu. Once again, hit more options, make sure preview is checked, and then click on the black box next to shading color. If you're not worried about matching a specific code, of course you don't have to write down any codes. You can just use this menu and select whatever color you want. And I actually made a mistake when I was doing this too. Make sure before you click on 3D Extrude and Bevel that you've highlighted the object using the selection tool and then click on it. So as you can see, now that this effect isn't applied, it looks like this. That's why hitting preview is so important. But if I go back to more options, check this black box and then hit the red here and hit OK, it applies that red to the 3D Extrude and Bevel. If I click on that again and I change these RGB values to match the purple of the stroke here, go ahead and do that. And then I'm just going to hit OK. You can see that the 3D Extrude now matches our stroke and we have a totally customized look here. So if you really want to customize things a whole bunch, that option is certainly there for you to do so. And the last thing we're going to cover here is the drop shadow. Make sure you've highlighted over the text again so that when you make the changes you can actually see them. Click on the drop shadow button right here. Hit the preview button so we can see our effects in real time. The opacity by default is at 15%. If I make it 100%, you can tell that the drop shadow is now 100% solid. And the color box right here, you can change this color to be whatever you want using this color picker. So let's say I want to make it maybe a really dark blue would make sense for what we're working on right here. I actually don't want this to be 100% solid, so I'm going to change this back down to 15%. Click on a different box here just so it applies it, hit OK. We now have a customized color for our drop shadow as well. And one more thing, these little eyeballs right here turn the effects on or off. So if I highlight over this text so that it's actually active here in our appearance window, and I check this eyeball next to drop shadow, you can tell that it actually turns off that drop shadow. So if you don't want drop shadows at all, you can just hit this eyeball icon, which is now gone, and it will hide that drop shadow. If you hit the eyeball again, it might take a second to render, but that drop shadow will then reappear. The same thing applies for the 3D Extrude and Bevel. Like let's say you just want this to be a simple stroked font. Click on that eyeball next to 3D Extrude and Bevel, and that's exactly what you'll get. If you want your 3D Extrude and Bevel back on, just hit that eyeball once again, and you can see the effect applied. So it's a really easy way to customize your work without being destructive at all, as you can always turn off and then turn back on the effects whenever you want to. But that's really it for this tutorial. If I missed anything that you really want me to cover better, feel free to ask in the comments section of this video, and I'll do my best to answer any questions that you may have. But hopefully this pack is pretty darn easy for you to use. I try to make it really easy to just go in here, hit an effect, and then get something really cool out of it. Honestly, these effects are some of the favorite things I've ever made because of how good they are at converting things into something that's really cool and bold in just a couple seconds. So thanks so much for watching this instructions. I really do hope they were helpful, and remember, if you have any further questions, don't hesitate to ask. I'm always happy to help.